Kansas has a landlord-friendly breaking lease framework with a statutory duty to mitigate and strong preemption provisions that ensure statewide uniformity. The governing law is found in the Kansas Residential Landlord and Tenant Act, Kansas Statutes, Chapter 58, Article 25, which addresses the landlord's obligations when a tenant vacates early. If you're a landlord or tenant in Kansas, the KRLTA provides a clear statutory foundation with broad landlord discretion. Let's start with the landlord's duty to mitigate damages. Under Kansas Statute Section 58-2565, when a tenant abandons the property or breaks the lease, the landlord has a statutory duty to make reasonable efforts to re-rent the unit. Kansas's mitigation requirement is codified. The landlord cannot leave the unit vacant and hold the departing tenant liable for the full remaining rent without making genuine re-rental efforts. The landlord must take reasonable steps: advertising, showing, and accepting a qualified applicant who meets the landlord's standard screening criteria. If the landlord re-rents, the departing tenant's liability is limited to rent during the vacancy period, plus reasonable re-rental costs. If the landlord fails to make reasonable efforts, the departing tenant's liability is reduced by the rent the landlord could have collected through reasonable mitigation. Kansas's preemption statute, Section 12-16-119, limits local governments from regulating certain aspects of the landlord-tenant relationship. This means the breaking lease framework is uniform across the state. No Kansas municipality has enacted local provisions that add requirements beyond the KRLTA. Lawrence, Topeka, Wichita, and the Kansas City suburbs all operate under the same framework. Early termination clauses are generally enforceable in Kansas. The state does not cap early termination fees. A clause requiring 30 to 60 days notice and a fee of 1 to 2 months rent is typical and enforceable under Kansas contract law. The fee must represent a reasonable estimate of anticipated damages. Kansas courts will not enforce a provision that functions as an unenforceable penalty grossly disproportionate to actual losses. Many Kansas landlords include both an early termination option with a defined notice period and fee, and a lease break damages provision for situations where the tenant abandons without using the formal process. This two-tiered approach incentivizes communication and cooperation. Military members have the right to break a lease under the SCRA. Kansas has a significant military population. Fort Riley, home of the 1st Infantry Division, is one of the largest Army installations in the country and generates enormous rental demand in the Manhattan Junction City corridor. Fort Leavenworth, home of the Army Command and General Staff College, generates demand in the Leavenworth area. McConnell Air Force Base near Wichita generates demand in the southeast Wichita suburbs. SCRA lease terminations are extremely common near Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth. Fort Riley's regular personnel rotations, typically 2 to 3 year assignments, create predictable lease break patterns. Fort Leavenworth's staff college students typically serve 1-year assignments, creating annual turnover cycles. Landlords near both installations should have standardized SCRA processes. Active duty service members with qualifying orders can terminate by providing written notice and a copy of the orders. The lease terminates 30 days after the next rent due date. No early termination fee or penalty applies. Kansas does not have a specific state statute providing enhanced lease-breaking protections for victims of domestic violence in the same detailed framework found in states like Oregon, Washington, or Massachusetts. Kansas does have the Protection from Abuse Act and the Protection from Stalking Act, which provide protective orders. But these laws do not include specific lease termination provisions. Domestic violence victims in Kansas who need to break a lease must rely on general contract principles, negotiate with the landlord, or seek assistance through advocacy organizations like the Kansas Coalition Against Sexual and Domestic Violence. Including a voluntary domestic violence termination clause in your lease is a recommended best practice. Tenants in Kansas may break a lease if the landlord fails to maintain habitable conditions. Under Kansas statutes, Section 58-2553, the landlord has a duty to comply with applicable building and housing codes, make repairs necessary to keep the premises fit and habitable, and maintain essential systems. If the landlord fails to act after receiving written notice, the tenant has remedies under the Act. Under Section 58-2559, the tenant must provide written notice identifying the deficiency. The landlord then has 14 days to make repairs for non-emergency conditions. If the landlord fails to act within 14 days, the tenant may terminate the lease. For emergency conditions, failed heating in a Kansas winter, gas leaks, structural failure, the response time is shorter. Kansas also recognizes constructive eviction. If the landlord's failure to maintain the property or affirmative actions render the unit uninhabitable, the tenant can treat the lease as terminated. The tenant must vacate within a reasonable time. Kansas has specific provisions regarding abandonment under Section 58-2565. If a tenant abandons the property, the landlord can retake possession and re-rent. The statute provides guidance on determining abandonment, absence from the property, non-payment of rent, and removal of personal belongings. The landlord must still fulfill the mitigation duty after abandonment. Kansas also has a strong anti-retaliation provision under Section 58-2572, creating a 6-month rebuttable presumption of retaliation if the landlord takes adverse action after a tenant exercises a legal right. This is relevant when a tenant terminates based on habitability. A landlord who pursues aggressive damage, claims against a tenant who left due to legitimate habitability issues, faces the risk of a retaliation defense. From a practical standpoint, Kansas's rental market is concentrated in a few population centers. The Kansas City Metro, specifically the Kansas side including Overland Park, Olathe, Shawnee, Lenexa, and Leawood, has the strongest market. Johnson County is one of the wealthiest counties in the Midwest, with strong demand and quick re-rental, typically 2 to 4 weeks. When a tenant breaks a lease in Johnson County, the financial exposure is usually limited. Landlords operating across the Kansas City Metro need to understand the state line distinction. Properties on the Kansas side operate under Kansas law. Properties across the state line in Kansas City. Missouri operate under Missouri law with different requirements, including Kansas City's local tenant protections. Wichita has a moderate market driven by aerospace, healthcare, and coke industries. Re-rental is moderate, 2 to 4 weeks in desirable areas. McConnell AFB generates military lease terminations. Manhattan Junction City, adjacent to Fort Riley, has a heavily military-driven market. SCRA terminations are constant, and the regular rotation of 1st Infantry Division personnel creates predictable vacancy cycles. Landlords in this corridor must have efficient make-ready and marketing processes. Leavenworth, adjacent to Fort Leavenworth, sees annual turnover as staff college students rotate in and out on one-year assignments. The officers attending the staff college are typically majors and lieutenant colonels, excellent credit, strong income, and predictable departure dates. Landlords near Fort Leavenworth can anticipate almost exactly when each military tenant will terminate. Topeka, the state capital, has a stable government-driven market with moderate re-rental times. Lawrence, home to the University of Kansas, has a tight student market where lease breaks time to the academic calendar fill quickly. The western Kansas communities, Dodge City, Garden City, Liberal, have markets influenced by meatpacking. Workers in the meatpacking industry may break leases when they relocate for better opportunities or when employment circumstances change. Having clear early termination provisions helps manage these transitions. One best practice for Kansas landlords include a clear early termination clause that works alongside the statutory mitigation duty under Section 58-2565. The clause should provide a defined path for the tenant, notice period, and fee, while preserving your right to pursue actual damages if the tenant abandons without following the process. Another best practice: begin re-rental efforts immediately and document every step. Kansas's statutory duty is clear and enforceable. Keep records of listing dates, advertising platforms, inquiry counts, showings, and acceptance dates. A third best practice for landlords near Fort Riley and Fort Leavenworth: build SCRA terminations into your business model. Fort Riley's 2 to 3 year rotation cycle and Fort Leavenworth's annual staff college turnover create predictable patterns. Use these patterns to plan your marketing, make ready schedules, and financial projections. Kansas limits the security deposit to 1 month's rent for unfurnished units and 1.5 months for furnished units. The deposit must be returned within 30 days. If the landlord fails to comply, the landlord may be liable for 1.5 times the amount wrongfully withheld. These rules apply to broken leases and normal move-outs alike. For the complete guide to Kansas breaking lease laws, visit tenantscreeningbackgroundcheck.com. Subscribe to our channel for every state in our Breaking Lease Law series.